Welcome to the Great Debate. Here is Mr. 1920s and Mr. 1930s. Now, each side will give an overview, have a little debate, and then the press will ask questions.
Hello. I'm Mr. 1920s. Because of me, the people were happier. I'm called the Roaring Twenties after all. Not only that, a great thing to know about me, the government didn't meddle with people's businesses while I was around. It gave me the jitters if I had to be controlled by the government and told how to run my business, right? Cars use a lot more too, which significantly increased the economy.
Hello, folks. I help the poor, suffering people in America recover after the 1920s caused damage. I provided many labor, business, job, and relief acts which helped Americans after the stock market crash, which Mr. Roaring Twenties here had started. With Mr. Roosevelt leading the way with his New Deal, 100 Days, and other policies, I have improved the nation.
Well, that was surely something. Now, though, it's time to begin the real debate. Gentlemen, you may start.
Wonderful. Mr. 1930s, you said you helped people, but must I remind you, the economy was at a new all-time low. When I was here, there was an increase in consumerism. People shopped at Sears, they had tons of spending money, and even free time. We could go to the movies, watch ball games, and sit at the dining room table on Sunday mornings and eat scribble crosswords. Most importantly, they could afford it.
Let me remind you that your overproduction and consumerism led the economy into a recession. The reason they couldn't afford it was because of the stock market crash that you caused. It was up to me to help all the suffering Americans. With my many acts, more Americans could live in suitable conditions. People also listened to President Roosevelt's fireside chats on the radio to build up their morale, and were able to watch movies like Grapes of Wrath.
And how on earth would they have time to watch movies and put time for Dear President's talks if we were in a Great Depression? Oh, right. They were unemployed. The unemployment rate skyrocketed so high, even the Empire State Building couldn't compete. At a peak of around 25% unemployed, I know I couldn't match up with that. Plus, economies are always having up and downs, Mr. 1930s. It just had to happen sooner or later, this depression of yours. If it didn't happen to you, poor old Mr. 1940s might have gotten slammed in the face, or dear old Mr. 1950s. It was inevitable.
Sure, the economy has a cycle. Was I ever contradicting that? I think you're being very undiplomatic, Mr. 1920s, with your slang and comments. Oh, I remembered. Americans were all lackadaisical in the 1920s. They didn't do anything but party all the time. They didn't improve anything except for the overproduction of consumer goods, which eventually led to all the problems. I've only stated what I've done to help the nation. Mr. 1920s, maybe you should state what you have done to help, because all I hear is excuses, blaming, and how Americans are stupid partiers.
Well, I'd say...
Gentlemen, audience, please calm down. Now, let's allow the press to ask some questions, right?
Would you mind explaining why entertainment was so important? Rather, what was it? You kept mentioning it.
Thank you, miss. The most important source for entertainment was FDR's fireside chats. He relieved the American public and reassured them that they would be okay. Also, Americans enjoyed music, adventure programs, daytime dramas, comedies, movies, and social criticism. There were many writers and painters. There were big bands, war songs, swing music, etc. Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and Glenn Miller were great musicians, and Dorothy Lange showed how the Great Depression affected the suffering Americans through her photographs. People still had the chance to have fun.
Well, on the other hand, entertainment here varied. I'm called the Jazz Age for a reason. There are many people enjoying themselves, dancing to music. People like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith created wonderful songs. Not only that, we had a burst of African American culture. I'm also called the Harlem Renaissance sometimes too. If Americans weren't singing and dancing, they were watching talkies and listening to their favorite radio stations. Mass media was spread very far and wide. Besides that, we also had ball games, boxing matches, and not only that, there's entertainment all around.
Ah, yes. Would you tell us how technology influenced you?
Technology didn't change throughout my time. Farmers used tractors, disc plows, and barbed wire. Americans who lived in suburbs and cities used radios, cars, airplanes, and other technology which was present in previous decades. Tied with technology, communication was very important. People could communicate via mail, handheld phones, and others. FDR used the radio as a form of communication with the American public in his fireside chats.
The efficient way was the best way to do things is my motto. During my time, there was an increase in things that simply made your lives better. Automobile usage was way more common and people got to places faster. The suburban areas, as I like to call it, suburbs, were rapidly expanding. People used cars to drive to their homes in the suburbs and practically everywhere. Airplanes were used to carry cargo and people across the country in matters of hours, had their use also rising. Not only that, the assembly line, used by Henry Ford, was widely spreading throughout businesses, factories all across the United States. People could hear their news through talkies at the cinema and get all the entertainment through the radios. Mass media, like I said before, was on the move and getting to people everywhere.
Okay, so now, what were some changes in your society? Any important reforms, or were there any notable changes?
Unfortunately, most Americans were depressed during the Great Depression. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and there were the suffering and minorities. That's why, when Hoover realized that the Depression was not going to get over quickly, he acted. Once FDR was elected, he put out multiple acts helping out with relief, reform, and recovery. His 100 Days, New Deal, and Second New Deal helped the nation greatly, along with the many acts and administrations passed during his presidency. Along with FDR, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, helped out greatly with political activities. There was a rise of social reform, improvement in unemployment and labor, and many other things which helped the nation rise up again.
It's not my fault the Great Depression happened. Anyhow, during this time, a lot of things happened. African Americans were moving north. We call this the Great Migration north. They spread far and wide, but there was a community in New York, in a neighborhood called Harlem, that had the most influence. Jazz flowed throughout the streets and made it increasingly popular. People began to move from rural to urban areas as well. People challenged the traditional values and behaviors, like the flappers. Sadly, there was a lot of nativism, and the Ku Klux Klan rose again. The 18th Amendment and Volstead Act were also passed. It carried all the way until our great friend 1930s, when it got repealed. The 19th Amendment, the amendment that allowed women to vote, was also passed and caused the ladies of our nation to cheer.
Tell me about your economy and how consumerism was.
There was a huge bust in the economy due to Mr. 1920s. Overproduction and less consumerism in the late 1920s led the economy into a recession, and the stock market crashed. So many people lost their money in investments and stock, and even banks had no money. Of course, some people caused their own doom because of lack of responsibility. Others were innocent and were thrown off the street. The economy was unbalanced, and Americans suffered. Consumerism dropped until FDR was elected, and his many acts and administrations were passed which helped the American public rise up again.
For me, there was a boom, and we're not going to argue that point anymore. I told you, it wasn't my fault. Anyways, there was a mass production everywhere, new products on the market, and improved advertising techniques from World War I. Advertisements were printed on magazines, heard on the radio, and practically everywhere. Mail-order catalogs, as some like to call it, the consumer's Bible, were extremely popular and revolutionized the way people bought things. There was installment buying as well, and many people used installments to purchase homes, automobiles, and large objects. The economy was growing upwards, with many people producing and selling things at a rapid pace. Eventually, many people had the latest innovations. Not only that, people began to invest in the stock market. They bought on margin, which is risky but highly popular.
Let's move on to a different topic. How did politics influence you?
Well, first of all, there were two presidents during the 1930s, Herbert Hoover and FDR. President Hoover supported a hands-off government and thought the Depression would end quickly, so he failed to act fast, and therefore Americans then elected FDR. FDR was the best president ever. He enacted so many acts like the Social Security Act, which is very important, created so many administrations and effective programs. He really helped the suffering Americans conquer the great challenges they faced during the Depression. The government didn't take action until FDR pushed them to, because they were hands-off with Hoover.
As for me, hands-free was the best way. We had Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover during my time. All the presidents supported capitalism and allowed the businesses to regulate themselves. When the Great Depression first started, Hoover tried to keep his distance, I admit, but then definitely tried to help by expanding a few public works spending. There isn't a lot to say about it, ma'am, because my government was very hands-off.
Very interesting, gentlemen. Thank you for asking. Members of the press, I believe it's about time we close up. So, any last words, gentlemen?
I'm the best, Mr. 1930s. You can't deny that. After all, I'm not known as the age of the Dust Bowl, where people were constantly having to run from a storm and left homeless.
Actually, Mr. 1920s, I'm the best. I helped the nation out more than you ever could have. Suffering Americans became happy Americans. I didn't waste my time partying, and I certainly wouldn't argue that I'm the best if I were you. It's extremely evident who is the best. Me!
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in witnessing the great debate.
Actually, Mr. 1920s, in the economy due to Mr. 1920s, more production and less consumerism in the late 1920s led the economy into recession, and the stock market crashed. So many people lost their money in investments and stock, and even banks had no money. Of course, some